Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to have you here for what may be the most ambitious video that we've put out so far. We are going to be reviewing everything we've covered in the class so far. I will admit it won't be quite as deep as we did when we hit it the first time, but just a quick glance over everything to make sure we remember all our basics. So let's work through it together, starting at the very top. What is economics? Well, economics is the study of how human beings cope with this problem of scarcity by making choices. Dr. Mankiw says economics is the study of how society allocates scarce resources. Basically, both these problems drive at the same thing, which is there is scarcity in the world. There is a limited amount of resources to fulfill our unlimited wants. So this problem of the limited nature of society's resources is scarcity, right? So then the study of how society allocates scarce resources, we can apply that in a couple different ways. Microeconomics applies how does society manage its scarce resources on a small scale, specifically the individual scale, and the business scale, the firm scale. So we could say, microeconomics is the study of how households and firms, cope with this problem of scarcity and make decisions, right? Where macroeconomics, big, broad-scale economics, is more concerned with kind of country or global size economic ideas, a study of economy-wide phenomena, things like inflation, unemployment, economic growth, productivity, income differences across countries, all this kind of stuff. So now that we understand, or remember at least, what the basic definition of economics, micro and macro, are, we should consider we talked about two roles for the economist, and those two roles were a scientist and a policy advisor. So obviously there's many economists in the government that are going to make recommendations about policies and what we need to be spending our money on and all sorts of things like this. We would refer to these folks as policy advisors. We might find them within large governmental organizations like the IRS, the Federal Reserve, places like this. We also might find policy advisors in private organizations as well, kind of think tanks and stuff like this, right? We can also picture the economist as a scientist, right? It is a social scientist, and scientists collect data, they test hypotheses, they have to figure out, with good research, as much as they possibly can. So testing hypotheses, collecting data, these are kind of the role of the economist as a scientist, making policy recommendations, making spending recommendations. These are the role of the economist as a scientist. And we can remember back to those first days that economists think there are four factors of productions, the things we use to make things, right? Goods and services. So I'll list those real quick: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So of course land refers to the physical land and natural resources required for the goods and services to be produced. If you want to have a store, if you want to have a factory, you got to have a piece of land to put it on. Labor, of course, is just the workers that you need to get these products made, right? Capital, economists understand capital a little differently than financiers or accountants would. We don't think of capital as money, but rather capital is the physical tools and factories and things like this that we use to build these goods and services, that we use in production of these goods and services. So your capital might look like, the Kroger that you buy something in, or a factory, and it also might look like a cash register, or a forklift, anything that helps you get business done. And obviously, entrepreneurship is the kind of leadership, the management that brings the other three factors of production together. The land, labor, and capital. You need somebody to kind of grab the reins and take the land, labor, and capital and make it into something useful. And that's what we call entrepreneurship, that leadership required. And we can remember our first two models at this point. We covered a circular flow model that basically just showed how money and goods and services and the factors of production all move kind of circularly across the economy, in from consumers and out from firms, and vice versa, in this wonderful cyclical pattern. And we also talked about the production possibilities frontier, or PPF. The PPF shows all possible combinations of two goods that a given country can produce in a given amount of time. So remembering our first two basic models is going to be important. Okay, and let's roll along here. Let's roll along here and discuss very important idea to economics: absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Absolute advantage is the ability to make more of something than your competitors, than other producers. So if we take this at a country level, then we can picture an absolute advantage might be, well, the U.S. is better at making software, computer software, perhaps than a country like Vietnam. We have better resources and whatnot to encourage this behavior, right? And if we're being honest, the U.S. is probably better than Vietnam at the production of things like t-shirts and clothes as well. If we were spending all our resources on it, we could probably do better in absolute terms, in terms of maximizing the quantity produced, right? But it's important to remember, absolute advantage isn't the only advantage worth taking into account. We also need to take into account comparative advantage, which isn't just how much can you produce, but how much can you produce relative to what else you could produce. So while it is true that the U.S. might be better than Vietnam in the production of both software and t-shirts, because Vietnam is not very good at all at making software, but it is, relatively pretty decent at making t-shirts, they might have a comparative advantage. To put it in very specific terms, they can produce at a lower opportunity cost for t-shirts than can the United States. We talked about the example of Serena Williams and whether or not she should mow her lawn, right? She could probably, her opportunity cost of spending a couple hours mowing her lawn is massive, right? She could be making thousands and thousands of dollars and paying someone to come mow her lawn for a couple $100, and she would be coming out with a big windfall, coming out way ahead. So this idea of comparative advantage is all about the ability to produce at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. What are you giving up to get? And remember, that's all opportunity cost is. What are you giving up to get something? By choosing to listen to this video right now, you are giving up, I guess, a little more time sleeping or hanging out with your friends or whatever else you would be doing right now, right? This is your opportunity cost, what you give up to get something. Real quickly, let's move along here. Stepping forward in our review onto The basics of supply and demand. If you are keeping track along with me, supply and demand. So, a market is a group of buyers and sellers of a good, right? And we essentially kind of organize the buyers into this concept of demand and organize sellers into this concept of supply. The demand curve is an expression of the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. So the law of demand, we can remember, tells us that at higher prices, people want less stuff, and at lower prices, people want more stuff. And this should be very intuitive, right? If the price of something goes down, you are more tempted to buy more of it. And of course, supply, kind of the flip side of this, is a graph of the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. How much producers, sellers, are willing to sell at this price. And we can remember the law of supply tells us that higher prices are associated with higher quantity supplied. And this is simply because, no surprise, as the price of something increases, if you're selling it, you are more excited about selling it every time the price goes up just a smidge, right? Making you better off with those higher prices. So you are willing to sell more and more at higher prices. So let's recall some of the things that can shift demand and supply. Now, the first thing the book talks about is that demand can be shifted by income. Demand can be shifted by income. And this looks a little different depending on what type of good we are talking about. Let's recall real quick before I get ahead of myself that when we shift demand, we are not moving along the demand curve. So a shift in demand is a change in this demand relationship caused by anything other than a change in price, right? So we're not talking about the price of the good. If that was the case, we would just be moving along that existing demand curve to new quantities, demanded. And we will shift this whole curve, this whole line, to the left if there's a decrease in demand, or to the right if there's an increase in demand. I'll see if I can't throw a picture up to help make this clear. Okay. So again, this increase in income is going to be our first way. So if something is a normal good, when you make more money, you want to buy more of it. Economists think generally, if people have more money, they want to buy more stuff. And I think intuitively that should make sense. We call these normal goods, goods for which you make more money, you buy more stuff. This is as opposed to inferior goods, goods for which you make more money and you'd rather buy something else. So you're going to actually buy less of the inferior good. So we could picture maybe, like a fancy bowl of Japanese noodles at a restaurant versus one of those little ramen cups you can get at Walmart kind of thing. So, nobody actually, I'm sure I'll step on somebody's toes with this, but most people don't actually like those ramen cups, right? This is the cheapest food you can eat, right? The staple of college students, as the stereotype would indicate. So these are in an inferior good, right? You'd rather have something else. If you had more money, if you weren't a broke college kid, you'd rather be eating something other than ramen cups. So it's an inferior good. If your income increased, you would buy less of it. On the other hand, that fancy bowl of ramen or other Japanese noodles at a restaurant might be a normal good. If you made more money, you'd be happy to spend a little bit of it at the Japanese restaurant getting some of those delicious noodles. So if income increases, What change can we expect in demand? Well, if it's a normal good and your income increases, you buy more stuff, right? If it's an inferior good and your income increases, you buy less. Okay. And we can remember that prices of related goods can also shift demand, right? So there are substitutes and there are complements. A substitute, something you're willing to switch. So this might be your Coke versus Pepsi, thing like this. And complement, something you consume alongside the product. So this might be your peanut butter and your jelly, something like this, right? Goods that go together are complements. Goods that you can switch between are substitutes. Now, how does this play into our problem here? Well, if we increase the price of a substitute, that is going to increase demand for the good we're talking about. So if the price of Coca-Cola goes up, people are going to say, hey, now Pepsi has become relatively cheaper than Coke. I'm going to start buying some more Pepsi, right? The demand for Pepsi will go up because the price of their competition, Coca-Cola, has gone up. And this works in the opposite way with complements. So picturing peanut butter and jelly, if the price of jelly goes way up, what can I expect will happen to the demand for peanut butter? Well, demand would shift leftward because you buy peanut butter and jelly at the same time. Demand will shift leftward because it's going to decrease because it's become more expensive to buy the pair. Because jelly is more expensive, you have less of an incentive to buy that peanut butter. We can remember that, tastes can affect demand, consumer preferences. And it's worth mentioning that expectations about the future can affect demand. So we talked in class about the example of gasoline, right? So if gasoline prices are low, and you may see something in the news that causes you to expect in the future gasoline might be more expensive, then you're going to say, crap, I need to go to the store, I need to go to Kroger and buy some gas, right? Because the price is low today and I'm expecting it to go up in the future. This is this strong incentive for me to buy today, right? So demand will increase today if we expect a future price increase. And real quick, a couple things that can shift supply. Probably most significant, input prices and technology. So, if you're selling ice cream and it becomes more expensive to buy your sugar and your milk, you are not going to have a choice. You're going to have to pass those additional costs on to your consumer. We'll be shifting supply the same way we do demand, just moving that whole curve left or right. Remember, this shift in supply is anything that changes this relationship other than price. If we're just changing price, we're just moving along an existing supply curve to find different levels of quantity supplied. So input prices, technology. Obviously, if there are new technologies that allow us to produce things more cheaply, that we can pass those savings on to the consumer. So increases in technology can shift supply rightward, increasing supply. It becomes cheaper to produce every level of output at every price, right? Increases in the number of sellers can also shift demand. So, or supply rather, I apologize. So more sellers of a particular good enter a market. Once there's these new sellers of the good, there's more competition. There's more people trying to supply the good. So this means that at each price, more quantity will be available. This is a rightward increase, a rightward shift, an increase in supply. And we can remember from some of our first weeks together how equilibrium moves in response to shifts in supply and demand. So we can picture our basic supply and demand model, and we're going to shift demand rightward. Well, more people are wanting the product, so what's going to end up happening is it's going to be sold at a higher price and a higher quantity, since more people want it at even higher prices, right? This rightward shift in demand. Interestingly, a rightward shift in supply will not have this effect. Instead, of course, the quantity sold will increase, but the price will actually fall. If there's more sellers in the market, or if new technologies are introduced to make it cheaper to produce, we still produce more, but the price is actually going to fall as we take advantage of our ability to produce more cheaply. So rolling right along here, we can remember our discussion of elasticity, and we mostly focused on two specific kinds of elasticity. Elasticity is just measuring responsiveness of changes in quantity to changes in price, or the price of another good, or income, things like this. And in this class, we focused primarily on price elasticity for demand and for supply. And we talked about a few different things that can determine the price elasticity of demand. We talked about, is this something you absolutely need, or is it a luxury that you could afford not to have? We talked about how are we defining the market. So if we define the market for as food, well, people absolutely need food. But if you define the market more specifically as ice cream, people may not absolutely need ice cream so intensely. Remember, elasticity is just showing us responsiveness. So price elasticity of demand shows, there's an increase in price. Well, how responsive are consumers to that? Do they buy less because the price has risen? Another determinant of this is going to be the availability of close substitutes. If there are close substitutes, then it's going to be much easier for consumers to just switch when the price goes up. So we could picture, going back to our example of Coke and Pepsi, if the price of Coke goes way up, maybe it goes from $2 a bottle to $3 a bottle, and Pepsi stays the same at $2 a bottle, people are going to switch towards Pepsi because it's become so much relatively cheaper, right? The consumers are able to respond to this price increase because they have a close substitute that they can switch to. Okay. And we talked about a couple specific examples of government policies that can play with our market equilibrium, right? So we talked about price ceilings and price floors, if y'all remember. A price floor is a legal minimum on the price at which a good can be sold, while a price ceiling is a legal maximum on the price at which a good can be sold. We discussed the example of minimum wage as a price floor and rent control as a price ceiling. And we discussed some of the potential benefits and potential drawbacks of engaging in price manipulation. And we did take a little bit of time to discuss how important price is as a tool, as a signal for economists, and really for the consumer as well. Wrapped up in price is all sorts of important information, and engaging in policies like price floors and price ceilings can sometimes dilute this information. Worth remembering, our study of welfare economics, well-being economics, not welfare in a government sense, but welfare in a people sense, right? And we talked about willingness to pay. The namesake of this YouTube channel, Willingness to Pod, right? Willingness to pay is the maximum amount that a buyer will pay for a good. And in order to find out consumer surplus, you just need to take willingness to pay minus the price that is actually paid for the good. So think about it like this. You're so excited to buy that PS5. Sticker price is $500 and you're willing to pay that $500. You're not excited about it, but you're going to go in there and you're going to pay that $500. So you go in there, you get up to the register and they say, "Oh, psych, this is actually 20% off. It's not $500, it's $400. Well, you're ecstatic. You went in there with every intention of purchasing that PS5 at that higher price. But because the sellers told you they were willing to take a lower price, you were able to get $100 worth of benefit, consumer surplus. $100 you didn't have to spend that you can now free up to spend on something else. We call this consumer surplus. It's also possible for essentially the same thing to happen on the producer side, right? So producers have a bottom dollar price that they can sell their good for, quote unquote, at cost, right? But they'd much rather earn a profit, if possible, or at least benefit from the sale. So, if the actual price is any higher than this bottom dollar at cost sale, then they will be benefiting. We call this benefit producer surplus, unsurprisingly. And of course, we said that one of our goals as economists may be to encourage markets that maximize total surplus, the benefit to consumers plus the benefit to producers. And we talked extensively about tax policy. We discussed the problem of deadweight loss, how whenever we tax something, less people are going to buy it, right? Whatever you tax, you discourage. You tell people not to buy something, right? So this decreased quantity of sale, economists call this lost surplus because of this decreased quantity sold. They call that dead weight loss. Dead weight loss. And this is one of our biggest problems with taxation and with government policies like price ceilings and price floors. This problem of dead weight loss. If we make taxes, as we saw in class, if we make taxes especially large, so a 90% tax on income or like a $30 tax on a pack of cigarettes, well, this is really going to discourage that behavior very intensely, right? And we talked about other things that we can do as policymakers to make the size of this deadweight loss as small as possible. And one of those was we can place taxes on markets with inelastic supply and demand that don't respond to price changes. That way, it's essentially a tax is just a price increase. That way, when this price increase hits this market, the producers and the consumers don't change how much they are buying and selling. Since that quantity sold doesn't change very much, the size of the deadweight loss doesn't change very much. And we can remember that deadweight loss looks like a nice little triangle cut out of our supply and demand model. And we discussed tax incidence, right? The economic burden of taxation. And we said that tax incidence falls not on who the law says it should, but rather on the more inelastic party. The more inelastic party. So we could picture a world where some form of medicine is taxed. Maybe we put tax on allergy medicine per se. Well, if you really need that allergy medicine. You're a consumer that has very inelastic demand. You are not going to respond to price changes. Well, then that tax is going to be stuck right on you, especially if the manufacturer is able to buy and sell as much as they want. They're very responsive to price changes, elastic supply. So we found through this sort of analysis, this sort of logic, that the party that is more inelastic, less responsive to price changes, is the party that will bear the greater burden of a tax. It doesn't matter who the law says has to pay the tax. It matters who is the more inelastic party. And in our discussion of taxes, we also talked about sizes of taxes can be important. As I mentioned before, a very, very big tax comes with it a very, very big dead weight loss. And we expressed this using the Laffer curve. Very famous economist Art Laffer, who lives in Nashville now. He argued if you make taxes too big, eventually they make less money. So picture it something like this. A 2% income tax, right? Well, 2% off what you make is not going to drastically change your incentive to work, right? So you're just going to work pretty much the same amount you would have had you not had this 2% income tax. However, if the tax rate is not 2% but 90 or 95, you could picture a world where your incentive to work is much more diminished, right? If instead of making 98% of the money, you only make 5% of the money because of this massive tax, you may not want to work as much. You're not getting the same benefit you did when the tax was smaller. So essentially, the Laffer curve shows us that increasing tax size increases tax revenue, but eventually the deadweight loss grows so enormous that increasing tax size doesn't really increase revenue, right? It lowers it. It makes it smaller. We can make our taxes bigger and bigger and bigger, but eventually they will make us less money. Okay. And rolling right along here. We spent a couple weeks on the economics of public sectors, talking about externalities, public goods, and the tax system. In our discussion of externalities, we can remember an externality is a uncompensated impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander. I'm going to take 2 seconds to step away, and we will return to this wonderful review shortly. All right, and we're back. So, let's recall here, if we can. Externalities come in two kinds, positive and negative. So, positive externality is a benefit. So somebody buys something and there is an unrelated benefit to a third party, right? So we could think maybe of education, right? So right now you're paying me to teach you some economics. Hopefully, I cross my fingers that you guys get some benefit out of this to help society on top of the benefit that you are going to get in terms of your higher earnings, of course. So that's your private benefit, the benefit for you, but there's also a social benefit of you being a well-educated citizen and hopefully a better voter and things like this, a better citizen. And there's also negative externalities. So we talked about smoking, we talked about pollution. This is when you buy something and there's this unrelated effect on somebody else. So you smoke that cigarette and it hurts somebody else because you're putting cancer in their lungs and it stinks and all this stuff. Or you're a company that has to pollute in order to produce something. Well, there's a cost associated with that through acid rain and potentially, climate change, things like this. So, negative and positive externalities. And we talked about some ways that the government can address externalities and some ways that individual people can address externalities. and it's just worth it to keep those in mind. We also talked about public goods and common resources. We can remember we had two questions. Is a good excludable, and is a good rival in consumption? We said goods that are both excludable and worth defining those real quick. Excludable means you can be prevented from using a good. Usually the point of prevention is, can you pay for the good? Can you afford the price? Sometimes it's by some other quality, but usually can you pay for it? And is a good rival in consumption? Does my having it hurt your ability to enjoy it? So if a good is both excludable and rival in consumption, we call those private goods. So this is, a marker, an ice cream cone, anything that you buy with the intention to use yourself. We talked about public goods, which are neither excludable nor rival in consumption, so you don't have to pay for it. There's no way to prevent you from enjoying it. But also, my enjoying it doesn't hurt your enjoying it. We talked about examples of national defense and things like this, tornado siren, this kind of thing. So that's a public good. We talked about goods that are excludable, so you do have to pay or you do have to have some quality to get you into the group. Are excludable but are not rival in consumption, which means my enjoying it doesn't hurt your ability to enjoy it. We call these types of goods club goods. Examples are really any kind of subscription service, be it your insurance, your cable television, your Netflix, and also apps and stuff like this that you would download on your phone and wouldn't be rival in consumption, wouldn't hurt someone else's ability to enjoy those products. And lastly, we talked about common resources, which are not excludable. Everyone can enjoy them. You don't have to pay a price to, but are rival in consumption. My using it hurts your ability to use it. So we talked about fishing and how if I go catch all the fish in the pond, then there's no fish left when you want to go fish. So we are rival in consumption, even though we can both fish without being excluded. Excuse me. So rolling right along here, we discussed one way that economists might try and figure out whether or not to invest in a public good is using a cost-benefit analysis. Essentially what this looks like, we are going to ask whoever we're talking to for an estimate of how much this public good costs. Say it's a new road that we are building, so they're going to tell us, this road is going to cost $5 million for the city to build. And then we need to weigh that $5 million against potential benefits to society. Less traffic, easier for emergency vehicles to move around, less delay getting people to work, less time wasted on commute. So potentially these benefits we can calculate in dollar value terms. And so we'll get these all in dollar value terms, and we'll compare the dollar cost to the dollar benefit and decide which one is greater and whether or not we should invest in this public good. We call this a cost-benefit analysis. And it's worth remembering hopping back to our problem of externalities just briefly. Private parties may be able to solve this problem of externalities, right? Famous economist Ronald Coase argued that if we can just minimize our transaction costs, minimize the cost of doing business and settling on an agreement, that's the best way to address externalities. Just let individual people do it. So if we can bargain freely and all of our what I own and what you own is very clear, we may be able to address this problem of externalities on our own. We called that Coase's theorem. And hopping ahead to here, I know I'm hopping around an awful lot, but hopping ahead to our next chapter, our chapter over tax systems. We discussed that the U.S. federal government gets most of its money from income and payroll taxes right now. We discussed that the state governments get most of their money from sales and property taxes as of this moment. And we discussed some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks of choosing to use those specific taxes. And we said taxes generally come with two costs. One of them we've already talked about, and that is deadweight loss. The other one is the administrative burden. And this is the cost spent on trying to figure out how much my company or my income owes on my taxes, right? And we said if we were concerned with efficiency, and only efficiency, not fairness, not equity, but just how efficient a tax is, minimizing this deadweight loss, minimizing this administrative burden, then our hypothetical best tax would be a tax that charges everyone equally. It doesn't discourage anyone's behavior because all behaviors are treated completely the same, and it doesn't discourage any or encourage any spending on, figuring out tax burdens. So nobody has to pay the people at H&R Block. Nobody has to pay the people at the IRS if we can minimize these efficiencies. And one way we could do this is with a lump sum tax, a tax that often thought to be the most efficient because it isn't encouraging or discouraging anything. Everyone is charged the exact same. But we said efficiency isn't our only goal, right? It is good to minimize cost, but it's also important to remember we may want to consider tax equity as well. How fair are our taxes? And we talked about two different principles that could help us decide whether or not our taxes are fair. One of these was the ability to pay principle, the idea that taxes should be paid by those who can afford to bear the economic burden of these taxes. And another principle we discussed was the benefits principle, which is the idea that you should pay for whatever benefits you receive from the government. So if you take kind of a very dollar-oriented view, then you may see the benefits principle as saying, well, poorer folks should pay more in taxes because they get so much in dollar terms of assistance from the government. On the other, the flip side of this, wealthy people certainly enjoy an awful lot of benefit by living in our society with our, police, fire. They have more to lose from, theft or damage because they have more stuff in the first place, right? So they may, depending on your perspective, receive more benefits than other people. So, benefits principle is just a guiding idea that we need to keep in our heads as we try and figure out what the best taxes should be. Okay, never a dull moment. Keeping rolling along here on to what in my book is chapter 13, the costs of production. So we wanted to figure out how businesses are going to make the most money. In order to do that, we wanted to start by understanding the costs that businesses faced. So we talked about total cost is all they're spending, right? Fixed and variable costs. Fixed cost is spending that doesn't vary with output, so you got to pay the same rent no matter how much product you sell. And variable costs are costs that do vary with output. So some things like inventory and workers, you have to pay more to sell more. And some things like rent and insurance, you don't have to pay more to sell more. It's a fixed cost. And we also talked about the difference between implicit costs and explicit costs. Implicit costs are, all the associated opportunity costs, and explicit costs simply are things that require an outlay of money. So you have to physically write a check to pay your rent, but you don't have to write a check to pay the opportunity cost of going into business, right? So we talked about examples of your money being able to make more than your spending on your company, and you may be able to make more in another job, another profession. And this led us to two different understandings of profit, this implicit versus explicit cost. Where an accountant sees only explicit costs, if you don't have to write a check for it, then the cost doesn't exist. An economist would take into account all opportunity costs. So you want to include not just the explicit costs, what you have to write a check for, but also the implicit costs, the opportunity cost of you going into this business, the opportunity cost of your money going into this business with you. What else could your financial capital, what else could you be doing, right? So economists take into account both implicit and explicit costs, and this leads to an understanding of economic profit that's a little smaller than accounting profit, right? And a very important measure of cost is marginal cost. Marginal cost is absolutely critical to understanding economics. This is the cost of one additional unit of production, one additional unit of output. How much does it cost me, if I'm a coffee shop, to sell one more cup of coffee? If I'm making board games, how much does it cost me to make one more board game? Marginal cost, the additional cost associated with one more unit of output. And we also talked about different forms of average costs and things like along those lines, average fixed, average total, average variable costs. And we had different uses for these average costs, but just understanding all we have to do is divide the original by quantity to get average, right? Okay. We talked about some different types of market structures, and really what was separating these types of market structures was varying degrees of market power. Market power is the ability to influence price. Our first type of market structure we discussed was the example of very, very, very little market power. Very little market power, essentially no ability to change price. Price takers. This is the market of, this is a competitive market, right? A perfectly competitive market, it's sometimes called. In perfectly competitive markets, the firms do not earn long-run profits, and all the products are essentially identical, right? So our example in class was gasoline and also commodity markets, so markets for corn and things like this. Monopolistic competition, a little bit of market power, but not a ton. This is characterized by many firms, and there's still no long-run economic profit, but there potentially can be short-run profits and accounting profits, and firms in monopolistically competitive markets have this incentive to differentiate their products, to come out just as unique as they can, to try and stick out. The strongest incentive to advertise we find in monopolistically competitive markets. We talked about monopolies, which are markets that only have one seller. We talked about three different potential reasons that these monopolies might arise. Natural monopolies, when there's a large fixed cost associated with getting into the business. Resource monopolies, where you have exclusive rights to a critical resource. And government-regulated monopolies, where the government, through licensing or patenting or things like this, give you exclusive right to production of a certain good. We also talked about oligopoly, which is a market with a few firms. Generally, firms in these markets produce similar goods, but that's not always 1,000% true. It's a nice generality. The critical thing here is that there are a few firms. And we discussed some controversial business practices like cartel behavior and collusion in our discussion of game theory. along with oligopolies. And we also talked about some other controversial business practices. Resale price maintenance was setting your retail prices above your wholesale prices. Tying was selling multiple products together. And we discussed predatory pricing, which involves artificially lowering prices to drive your competitors out of business. All of this we can find in chapter 17 on oligopolies. It's worth remembering our last day in class, we discussed the budget constraint and indifference curves, right? And the budget constraint was the limit on combinations of goods that a consumer can afford, right? The limit on combinations of goods that consumers can't afford. This is the budget constraint. It's a line that expresses, given your income, all the stuff that you can buy. And we applied this to all different kinds of situations, savings versus spending today, labor versus leisure, all sorts of stuff like this. And we said in response to a price change, two independent effects will happen essentially one after the other simultaneously. And we talked about these effects as the income effect and the substitution effect. So let's say, just for this simple example, we'll use the example from the book. We're trying to decide between quantities of pizza and quantities of Pepsi to buy, given our income. Well, we are going to have to balance between these, right? We're going to have to find our happy medium. And in order to do this, we're going to optimize at the highest indifference curve we can find. Indifference curves, of course, are lines that express combinations of goods that make us equally happy, give us the same levels of utility. But anywho, so we're facing this price change with our budget constraint. We see this price change, and now we have two independent effects happening. So the substitution effect refers to the idea that, so we're choosing between pizza and Pepsi. If Pepsi becomes much, much cheaper, well, that's going to tell you relative to pizza, Pepsi is now cheaper. And relative to Pepsi, pizza is now more expensive. This tells me I need to buy more Pepsi relative to pizza. I need to change my marginal rate of substitution, the rate at which I'm willing to trade between these goods, to reflect the new price ratio, the rate at which the market is willing to trade between these goods. The income effect, on the other hand, now same situation, Pepsi becomes much, much cheaper. I feel richer because I can buy more Pepsi than I could before. I have more purchasing power than I did before. And because of this, I can buy more stuff, which is the goal, right? So I feel richer, I can buy more of everything, and I'm able to move to a higher indifference curve. This is the income effect. Okay. I think we will stop right there, call it quits. I want to thank you guys so much for taking the course, and hopefully this has been a useful review. I certainly hope that you get a lot of benefit out of it. Please let me know if you have questions. I am here to help. Just shoot me an email, and we will get through the rest of this very strange semester together. Thank you guys so much. Bye-bye.